welcome to this week's episode of the Huddle Breakdown with me, Laura Bradburn. I am joined as always by James and Alan. James, how you doing?
I'm doing well, enjoying my late summer weather. Gets very hot, but not humid here, which is delightful. So end of August into September is the best time of year for my area. So enjoying that. As you can see with my very pinkish hue complexion, rarity. I look like more like Alan every day.
Well, I was going to say I can't speak for Alan in down south because I don't know how much better it is down there. But I've got no sympathy for somebody finding it too hot or humid in the summer because we appear to have had this funny, strange orange ball in the sky today. It's the first time I've seen it for a long time. Alan, how things down your way?
Like a classic sort of mid-November day, to be honest with you. But yeah, and just all good. Trying to remind myself that I shouldn't be like a teenager pressing refresh on my phone every 5 minutes to see who Celtic have not signed. So this is a welcome break from the obsession.
Well, I'm not going to criticise you for acting like a teenager because I have to say I've been watching Fabrizio Romano's feed like a hawk, and when a certain tweet came through a couple of days ago, I was drowning myself in ice cream, to put it mildly, just to try and get over the news that we all knew was coming. Matt O'Reilly, of course, has departed for the shoreline of Brighton and hopefully better weather than he's had in Glasgow, but certainly I wish him all the best. I think he's been a fantastic servant for the club. Just before we go into our main topics, Alan, it was inevitable, but what's your kind of brief summation of Matt O'Reilly's time at the club?
Yeah, just a lovely footballer and a lovely guy by all accounts. Came over incredibly well, genuine sort of person. Just a really intelligent, just love intelligent footballers. The way he played the game in terms of, he could play any of the midfield positions really equally adeptly. He provided many magic moments. He provided a level of consistency. I mean, he virtually very rarely missed a game injured. He was always present. And he was pretty, he, like anybody, he's a young player. He had his little blips occasionally, but in the main, tremendous performances. Very sad that he's gone, but I can't be a hypocrite with an analyst head on. We've spoken about this. Brendan Rodgers said he's at peak asset value. Celtic have, by all accounts, got a club record fee. I believe when it's all done and dusted, the add-ons are achievable. It'll be around 30 million to the club, which is it breaks the record we got for Tierney by quite some distance. I think he's gone to a good club. I think he'll go on to greater things, to be honest with you, and wish him all the best. Lovely player, lovely guy.
Yeah, James, I think with all this discussion around project signings and players coming in to improve the squad, if you'd told us 3 years ago or 2 years ago that this £1.5 million signing from MK Dons with a history of back problems was going to leave us for 30 million and destined for the top of the game, we might not have believed you, but he certainly made the most of the platform that Celtic have afforded him.
Yeah, I echo everything you've both said, and I think that he's the blueprint. That he's not forget about the numbers, but an intelligently scouted, recruited, signed, developed, and sold. Like from every step of that process. We can get into the nitpicky about was he the first pick and did we luck into it, and that's all fair. The process probably wasn't perfect, but take a snapshot of him from start to finish, and that's the model that we should be following from a sourcing of talent, developing of talent, and then moving along that talent in a win-win-win perspective, meaning that a win for us, a win for him, and a win for Brighton. And ultimately, maybe we will get another win if there's a participation in future sale if he ends up going to an even bigger club. The one addendum I'll add is I'm fascinated to see how Brighton utilizes him. I think they're going to use him deeper, which is kind of been my theory. If he was going to play in the English Premier League, that would probably be where he would need to go because of some, he doesn't have he's even on the bottom end of functional pace, I'd call it. And he's certainly not pacey or anywhere in the neighborhood of pacey. So I think he also would have fit with Atalanta, the way they use their kind of double tens, the way they use the creative one of their two that they deploy in their system. But those are an example of two clubs, very smart, know what they're doing, and it's not, I think, a coincidence that they were looking at a player like O'Reilly. So I wish him all the best. I don't have a English Premier League team that I root for. I've been following Tottenham a little bit just because of Ange, and now I'll definitely be paying attention to Brighton, not only because they're fun to watch, but also to be rooting for Matt.
Yeah, I already watched Brighton with a wistful look because I heard a rumour that apparently Ange was trying to get Mitoma for us before he went to Brighton. So, a world in which we had Jota on one side and Mitoma on the other, my head just boggles at the thought of it. But anyway, enough dreaming, back to reality in a post Matt O'Reilly world, which we now can say we definitely entered over the weekend against St Mirren. Alan, I want to come to you. You are our resident match reviewer, and you like to review it multiple times, break it down. What were your thoughts? I know that you've got some thoughts on the way Celtic are playing in terms of their pressing game. James hinted last week that we might get a little bit more of a challenge from St Mirren. Did it deliver on that front for you? How do you think we performed at the weekend?
Well, after wistfully thinking about that wing partnership and dreaming of idyllic, selling millions of players to the EPL, there is nowhere you come crashing down to earth with a thud than a wet and windy Paisley on a Sunday afternoon. So yeah, back to the prosaic, I guess. Listen, this was a game that had many risks inherent in it, right? When I saw the team line up, it just looked like Robinson had just gone all in on size, athleticism, physicality, all
Rugby.
that, and it was just going to be a really abrasive game. And then I saw the weather. It was a howling gale, driving rain, and I just thought, oh no, this is going to be a nightmare. Um, but in the end, it kind of wasn't. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he did complain about injuries. He kind of gave the Derek McInnes defence. So we had to play a game on midweek. We're not used to it. He did have a couple of injuries, I think, to players that might have been a little bit more progressive with the ball. But he ended up playing just the biggest, most athletic team he could possibly find. And packed kind of the midfield as well. So it looked like it was going to be a real struggle, but it just wasn't at all in any shape or form. Listen, the early goals help. Celtic have now scored 6 goals in 4 games before the 20th minute and 8 before the 40th minute. And what that does is it creates what we talk about game state. It creates a game state which is all in Celtic's favour because the opposition generally this season, if the first 3 opponents are to go by, aren't really going after Celtic. They're more kind of hunkering in. And obviously, if you go a goal down, you need to think about that. Do you continue and then just let Celtic relax into the game, keep possession, play keep ball, and have you running around all over the place, or do you go for it and then get picked off on the counter? And Celtic got a lot of pace up top this season, so it's a real conundrum for opposition now. And what is coming through to me is just the security really that the Celtic players seem to have in what they're doing. Really, there are no outfield players that weren't there last season. Everyone seems awfully well versed and know their jobs essentially, to use the vernacular. And I think that really is coming through. I think something that Stilian Petrov said, but it's echoed by other commentators that I've heard on, for example, Celtic TV, other Celtic leaning commentators who have been in with the squad, have perhaps spent time at Lennox Town, perhaps know some of the players. The one word that I always hear that's consistent is the word calmness, and Celtic are playing with a calmness and a surety about their play, which is really good to see. There's no panic whatsoever. Now, early goals help, and opponents who, as soon as they get it, just thrash it at the box. That kind of isn't. You might get a lucky break, of course, but it kind of played into Carter Vickers, and especially Scales' strengths, kind of heading away long balls. But So Celtic, you might argue that Celtic haven't been put under pressure yet. They've not gone a goal down in the game. They've not seen adversity in that sense. But I could flip that around and say, well, one of the reasons is that they're controlling these games and making it look easy is because of that calmness, because of that surety in their play. With overwhelming teams with possession, I know that sounds like damning with faint praise, but last season it was around 65% average. That includes European games, so bear that in mind. But it's up to like 74% now. It just allows Celtic to, rest with the ball, as Brendan Rodgers has said in the past. And we'll come on to the pressing later once we've got this match covered. But the pressing, by having so much of the ball, it allows you to be much more intense in the press. In terms of just last thing for me really, so sort of what went well, what didn't go well, pleasing aspects. Number one, Rio Hatate. So Rio Hatate is a player that we've made comments about in the past in terms of areas where he's perhaps not quite so strong. What really impressed me about this performance is that this is 3 out of 4 games now. He's played pretty well, and the fact that he stepped up and performed so well, given the nature of the opposition, the weather, all those things, the fact that Matt O'Reilly wasn't on the pitch and Hatate seemed to step up in responsibility. He was even second to Maeda in number of presses as well. That just to me was just really pleasing. And if we see, it was a mature performance, and that's what I've worried about Hatate. He can appear surly, a bit like a spoilt teenager at times. And if he can develop that maturity to his play, I think that'll be a massive bonus for Celtic. Maeda I loved as well, and he just continues to show that his strengths do outweigh, certainly at the SPFL level, do outweigh his weaknesses, of which there are many. I thought Bernardo looked comfortable. 0.35 xG against, that's the higher end of most of the vendors. That's what we're kind of averaging in 4 matches. I love that. We're just not giving the opposition a sniff. Things that could have gone better. Ida looked well short of match fitness, which I don't really understand because he's played for Norwich already, so I presume he's had a full pre-season. But I think you could also say he was possibly trying too hard, which I completely understand. It's a very human kind of reaction. And the last thing is just a little bit of, I didn't really like it. It seemed to me that some of Brendan Rodgers' comments have been perhaps a little bit tasty for public consumption as regards the transfer window. And I thought the substitutions were kind of making a point. Oh, look, at midfield, if we don't buy new players, it's Turley and Home. And I better put Ralston at left back because there's nobody else. It just seemed a little bit like that to me, a little bit cynical. Brendan's a bright guy; he kind of knows what he's doing. So anyway, listen. All in all, massively pleasing day. The fact that the second half was so dull is fine. The game was won. I'm okay with dull, as you know.
No, some really salient points there brought up, especially about the way that we performed. I'm desperate to talk about some of the things that Brendan said, but I think that maybe will be better put into context at the end of the transfer window when we see where we are. But I do agree there was certainly much going on between the lines if you want to listen to what he said and look at what he did against St Mirren. But like I said, we'll talk about that maybe when there's more time to do so at a more salient point. James, just to pick up on some of what Alan said, I think he hit the nail on the head when he talked about, and I think it articulates what I've liked watching about Celtic so far this season. We are playing with a calmness. We are playing with a sort of less frantic nature in which we do things. There was too many times I think last season where we ended up looking desperate at times when we were struggling a little bit more, and obviously the early goal from Callum McGregor will have helped that. But do you see or do you agree with what Alan's saying about the way we seem to have settled into a slightly more mature way of playing, not just Hatate but some of the other players who maybe are maybe just simply understanding what Brendan Rodgers is asking them to do a little bit better this season?
I think it's that. I think it's we're effectively fully fit, meaning that everyone's pretty much available. And what that's done is it hasn't stress tested and generated some of Alan's patented toxic combinations. So, for example, when St Mirren came out and tried to press high a little bit, that's almost kind of an insane thing to do against this version of Celtic, meaning that you've got, it's not Joe Hart anymore, it's Schmeichel. You've got Greg Taylor available and fit, playing effectively in a midfield role. McGregor's there. Carter Vickers is functional. Alistair Johnson's functional. Hatate can drop deep and help. I mean, it's just, you're probably not going to play a rugby team and high press Celtic, that version of Celtic, with much success. So I think, I think, as I've been saying the last 2 weeks, it's a combination of we are a functioning, well-oiled machine to a large degree right now, but we're not getting tested. And some of that has to do with, Alan and I always talk about context. The context is all three of our opponents have stunk this season so far. It's not like an outlier in just the game.
Just to jump in on that, because I remember you mentioned last week you were expecting a little bit more of a challenge from St Mirren than we'd seen from the opening two. Did they, I guess not, the word doesn't disappoint, because obviously it was to Celtic's benefit, but were you expecting more from them than they gave?
Yeah, I mean, when you line up with Gogic in the midfield, and I'll take Robinson as well. Like, generally, I've been pretty complimentary of Robinson, both when he was at Motherwell and now at St Mirren. I've actually been a huge fan of Gogic. I think he's one of the smartest signings that's been made and positioned well to thrive and be a really good player at the club level he's at and in the role that he's been given. But that's not midfield. So, I don't know the state of their injury situation. Like, I haven't been following them that closely. So when they lined up, as Alan said, the way that they did, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. And they played like a team that had a bunch of rugby guys playing midfield, and we just completely, ran riot over them.
Alan, we touched on it earlier. Obviously, you've been very impressed with the way Celtic are pressing, both in an attacking sense and a defensive sense. That's been one of the focuses of, the kind of reviews that you've been doing. What kind of interesting patterns are you seeing with that way in which we're playing that you think is benefiting the style of play in the game that we are playing?
Yeah, sure. So again, this is a function of the quality of overall team cohesion and understanding, because pressing and counter pressing. So, pressing is a very simple concept, right? It's just where you put pressure on the ball holder, you actively look to engage the ball carrier. Counter pressing is when you look to engage the ball carrier up to 5 seconds after you've lost control. Somebody's lost control of the ball, that your team has lost control of the ball. So StatsBomb do a job of measuring both pressures and counter pressures, and they also measure the intensity of them. And things like they add in the concept of a regain. So, has your press led to your team regaining possession? So, very simple. You can look at volume, and you can look at outcome. How often did you regain the ball? And they also measure the intensity of the press. So, essentially, the speed at which the player pressed. So, a lot of data in there, a lot of really rich data in there. So the St Mirren game is just going to use this as an example in terms of Celtic's development in this. As I say, I'll repeat again. I think it's probably something that surprises people, but Brendan Rodgers' Celtic side do press more often than even Ange Postecoglou's side does. Now, Celtic's possession actually dropped slightly last year from 67% under Ange in season 2 to 65%. So that's a little bit of context that would lead to Celtic perhaps pressing a wee bit more. But it was even more noticeable than just that small decrease in possession. And also when you think about pressing, and you can see this intuitively when you see the heat maps for the pressing activity, is that it's not something that the team does equally all across the pitch. So what I mean by that is pressing tends to be mainly the domain of the wide players, the two outside midfielders, so the number 8s, if you like, and the fullbacks, because pressing in the centre is a very risky thing to do, because generally the player with the ball has got 360 degrees with which to either pass and move, or pass back, or even sidestep and break the press. Whereas on the touchlines, geography is your friend, in that there's a limited angle at which a player can escape the press. They can either only go forward out the ways, or perhaps sort of back, but they're constrained by the physical lines on the field. So that's where most pressing activity tends to occur. So a player receiving the ball, perhaps at speed in the left back position, right on the touchline, is a good trigger for a team to press. What I've noticed is that the pressing activity is pretty well balanced. So again, this is a good indicator of team understanding. So we're not pressing any more in terms of volume from the right or the left. I think it was something like 55 pressures from the left most fullback, centre back, and wide midfielder and winger, and it was 56 on the right. But if you look at the actual heat map in terms of the intensity of those pressures and look at things like actual turnovers, it tells you a slightly different story. And again, it's probably not surprising that where are the hot spots on the field in terms of the greatest passing intensity. And guess what? It's wide left where Maeda is, and it's kind of right centre where Bernardo is, because Bernardo shares with O'Reilly a really innate intelligence about when to press and the intensity of that press. He's an athletic guy. So although the volume of pressing was equally applied across the field, the quality of outcome and the quality of the pressing based on the intensity of it is in the areas that you might expect. It was more on Celtic's left wing, Maeda, and it was more on Celtic's right flank. So you're looking at Alistair Johnston, Carter Vickers, and Bernardo being stronger in the press in terms of intensity than Scales, Taylor, Hatate. Now, at SPFL level, I suspect this isn't a massive issue. But that's the sort of thing that will scale and stress under pressure at the Champions League level. And I'm not telling anybody anything here that's new or different to what we've been speaking about for the last 2 years, really, in terms of where Celtic's weak points are. It's just to say that, Celtic can be simultaneously a really well organised, well-drilled team that, as James has pointed out, is working cohesively. But if you dig into the quality metrics as opposed to the volume and quantity metrics, you see that it backs up what we've been saying for some time, that left side just doesn't have the intensity, the athleticism, the speed to press with the same intensity as the right-hand side.
Yeah, James, I'm always fascinated because when Alan breaks something down like that, there is this conversation about, so many people say, "Oh, I like to watch the game and judge it by an eye test," and some people like to focus on the stats. I love when Alan brings these things up because I think it proves what you can see, which is that we have this weakness in terms of organisation and pressing down that left-hand side. Is that something? What's the biggest focus for you of how we would improve that? Is it a particular player on that side? Is it the system in which we do it? How would you see us sort of equalising that imbalance that there is in the team?
Defending and pressing, and this is fairly universal across sports, is mostly driven by athleticism and commitment, and commitment even better when you have it with intelligent players, right? So that's the hard part, like getting all of that package into a really smart, kind of high IQ player, like a Matt O'Reilly. Like that's why, he didn't go for 100 million, is because he's not super fast. If he did, he probably would be that kind of midfielder. So, do we have a smart player there? I think Greg Taylor's a very intelligent player. Like he seems to be a very high IQ player, but he's got limitations because he's not very big. He's not very fast. He can be quick, within that little burst in 1 or 2 yards. Like there's different aspects of athleticism. So, when you're talking about a system and the robustness of that system, you can get into engineering and physics here. This is why you get some of the people who do the analytics at some of these high-end clubs that's their domains, is because they think of things in a systems perspective. If it's not getting stressed against, Gogic in midfield, then those vulnerabilities don't shine through. Like you can get away with Greg Taylor's deficit in athleticism, or scales maybe with, I would say, his IQ at times. And when I say IQ, I'm not saying like raw, he's a dumb guy. I'm saying that the conversion of processing speed and saying, okay, I see that, then that's going to, go through the brain down to my foot and say, okay, pass the ball there. And to have the technical ability to do all this, or to make the, when to dive in, when not. So, when it's risky to be fouling, when to do a smart foul, when not to do a foul, when you're giving away a free kick around the box, all of these kind of like smart characteristics. But a lot of it's raw physicality and being well coached, that, everyone kind of knowing what their roles are and committed to doing them. That's a huge part of defending. Is that organ. And we saw that in the Champions League last year. I mean, we had, kind of spare parts playing against Feyenoord and even Atletico Madrid at home to a large degree. And we were so well organized, so well drilled that even with, kind of edge athleticism in certain positions, we were a tough team to break down. And we were doing very well in kind of limiting chances. So I think it's upgrading the athleticism that has to happen. And it needs to happen with those other attributes, and that's what makes it hard, is the getting those into one package. But there are ways to identify them and to kind of figure out, what are the signals what players are kind of smarter, which ones are over reliant on their speed, for example. Maybe their decision making isn't great. That kind of thing. So I think it's, getting as much of that package together. The other part of this is that what optimizes us for Europe is not the same as what optimizes us domestically. So if you're going to err in Europe, it's probably towards speed and athleticism versus, kind of technical on the ball stuff. Because, we're kind of the opposite of ourselves in Europe, where we don't have the ball as much, and, we're going to need to counterattack and defend a lot more. So that's all part of the inherent challenge that we face, is how do you strike that balance in improving those things. So yeah, athleticism is the easy answer, relative to, speed, size, and, commitment, the mentality to actually do what the coach is asking you to do, be coachable, and buy in.
James, I quite enjoy seeing the benchmarking that you put up on Twitter. I share it when I can. I don't always understand it fully, but it gives great context, and specifically in the case of what the benchmarking that you've done this week gives us context as to what we can expect from some of the new signings. Now, I do have a question I want to ask you about it, but before I do that, I thought it would be best just to hand over to you and let you sort of explain some of the interesting facts. I think you've done it for Engels, Bogus, Valley, I think, and Trusty, which I wonder if that particular defender will live up to his name, but I will leave it to you to explain some of the more interesting facts and figures that you've found out when you've been benchmarking these players.
Yeah, so the first thing, I'll set the stage as to kind of what I'm doing and why. So I always characterize this as an exercise, and it's important to keep that in mind, meaning that it's not like a prescriptive, all-in encompassing judgment or measurement of the quality of a player. The idea is to try to get a sense of potential strengths and weaknesses, look for signals for further investigation in particular. So I think of it as almost like a filtering and a screening process, and then, using it as a tool to ask more questions to then clarify and get a better sense. I was I had some personal schedule limitations on Saturday. So part of this was due to that, but I was like, you know what, I'm going to play a trick on people here, because I knew what was going to happen. And what I did is I took the Bogic benchmark exercise that I was doing, and I compared it. And this was all like spur of the moment luck. I saw Lewis Morgan was right next to his name in the one metric. And I'm like, oh, that's going to drive people nuts. Like, that's going to be a huge bias generating, like, cognitive dissonance trigger.
It's
So
called the John Joe Kenny paradox.
yes, exactly. Yes, we've dealt with this before,
Yeah.
and so I'm like, all right, I'm going to have a little fun here, and so I put it out with Bogic's stats, and I do it by category, and I do some of my own custom metrics like ratios and stuff that again, it helps me try to ascertain extracting signal from noise, so to speak.
Do you not
And
have any fancy names you call it like Alan does?
no, I don't actually. Alan's far more creative in that regard than I am. So I did that for a couple of reasons. One was to have fun, and I'm a jerk because I knew what it was going to do. The second thing is it does highlight. It was like a table setter for a bigger point, which is, we talk about this, and we've talked about extensively within the context of referees and the human bias that we all have. And I've talked about this on other platforms before. We human beings have not evolved to be rational. So when people say that analytics and stats should kind of be secondary or even just supplement the observations of human beings, that's like the opposite of evolution. Like that's not how it works. That's not the reality that we live in. The value of analytics, and obviously the better the quality of the data, the better, but or the higher the quality, the better, is you want to lay a foundational base of as objective of reality, a measurement of reality as you can, because we are inherently biased, right? So as soon as people see Lewis Morgan's name, the way that influenced their reading of everything else on the page, it just changes brain chemistry and anchoring bias and all these other biases. And they see that these guys play in the MLS, and you have a huge amount of people that just have a bias about MLS, whether it's good or bad. Most of it's bad in the context of Scotland.
I swear this happens when people read my tweets as well. They just see it's me, and then
Right. And I've talked about that within the context of players. I talked about it last season relative
well earned,
to serial.
Laura, to be fair.
Well, you are a wind-up merchant. Part of why I love you.
Come on, Laura, own it.
Yeah. Huge respect for that skill.
It's true.
But I talked about it last season with Serial Dessers, where he got off to this horrible start at Rangers. But if you actually looked at how he's performed, he's kind of like peak Morelos. That's how I've characterized him. And the tide's shifting a little bit because he's been playing well lately for them. But, it's that anchoring bias. So it's that first interpretation. And this is just how our brains work. Like it's how Homo sapiens brains operate. So the idea that you're the magic person that has the clearest vision of reality, that's how we delude ourselves, right? So the whole point of all this is to have a robust analytical framework to try and prevent ourselves from being the stupid apes that we are, and to question our biases.
So if you just on the Desters one, if you want to see another example of this, do a search for Lauren Shankland on Twitter. And it's exactly the point James is making.
Yeah.
Astonishing. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I do with this benchmark exercise is to try and start a process of gaining an objective profile of these players. Not, like I said, it's not an end all be all. And there's some basic analytical things that I do to try and, when I say process, it's my process. That's the other thing. When you talk about doing stuff analytically, what works for me is not what's going to work for Alan. Like we all have our own little picadillos, like all these biases that we have and all the stupidity we have. My forms of stupidity are different than yours, Laura, and they're different than Alan's, right? So for me to be good at analyzing stuff, part of the experience is figuring out how stupid you are in certain ways and then to try to compensate it, with the goal of all of us of trying to maintain objectivity. Because the goal, it's like science. What are you trying to do? You're trying to get towards truth. The whole point of this is some kind of objective truth. And so what I'm trying to do with this is to start a process to go towards that. And what I've looked at so far, and let me step back. So my assessment, and the guy might be wrong, is that there's not a very sophisticated framework of this kind of stuff going on at Celtic as it pertains to recruitment. And that, this is like my domain of career and all that stuff. So I've functioned at a reasonably high level with this kind of stuff over the years for, 25 years. So I kind of know what's high level and what's not. And I can sense that it hasn't been happening at Celtic. And, what I try to do as a layman, as a hobbyist with crappy data and limits that, that people that are paying StatsBomb $250,000 or £250,000 a year to get the Cadillac access of all the information. I'm trying to compete, so to speak, with lower quality tools. So I do the best I can. And part of that is taking these players, looking at a peer group, crafting a benchmark of their peers that makes some logical sense to try and answer specific questions, and then take a contextual evaluation of what their profile looks like. And not say they're a good player or bad players. That's not what this is about. It's trying to figure out how did they perform at the level they were playing, in the system they were playing in, for the team that they were playing for, in the league that they were in, and what you might be able to take from them. And I'll give you an example with Bogic. Bogic was at Ibiza on loan for a couple of seasons. Now, I've never been to Ibiza, but I can imagine that I've heard some things that if I was 20 or 21 and a professional footballer playing in Ibiza, that might be a risk factor. For me, it would have been. I don't know. I don't know about you.
There are some distractions, I think it's safe to say.
Right. But not only that, Ibiza was pretty crappy while he was there. And they played a lot of two up top striker systems on a team that was kind of right towards either in the relegation battle or getting relegated in the seasons that he was in. So that profile of what he's likely to be doing as a striker, a second striker or false nine, whatever you want to call it, where they're talking about, we might be signing him to replace Matt O'Reilly theoretically, or maybe he's going to be an attacking midfielder. And he's played in these kind of weird roles at LAFC. So this gets complicated. This is not, easy stuff or simple stuff. What I try to do is build simple graphics, simple information to display it, to start the process of delving into that complexity. That I don't get into a lot publicly because, it's more complicated stuff. We might in the future, but so bottom line, what I've seen in the players so far, again, I would say all of them are good players in different ways. The other thing I'll say is, I don't know if you guys ever bought a car, right? You ever read a guide as far as how you're supposed to buy a car and not get completely ripped off? Is you don't fall in love with a car, right? Because
in my experience, it's take your dad with you, but I shouldn't really say that.
That's probably a smart thing to do because he's not going to, theoretically, he's not going to get that emotional about your car. If you fall in love with the Honda and the Honda dealer rips you off and you could have bought a Toyota that's basically the same car for, a lot better price, right? So, so I'm not saying that any of these players are good or bad players. They just have profiles, and how do they align with us? Engels, I'd say so far, from what I've seen, very promising, interesting young player. I don't know what his role would be at Celtic. It'll be interesting. I don't see signals as far as what I would call like the high IQ indicators, as far as like spatial intelligence and creativity. He looks like a good athlete, like good work rate. So again, I think he would help in the European context, kind of box to box potential, defending, that kind of thing. I'm not sure on the ball and creatively and attacking. Bosic is very interesting. I think he's well suited for transitions, counterattacking, and that's where he's been thriving at LAFC this season. They play more of a counterattacking style, and he's been playing kind of a false nine, which again, I'm not sure how he fits at Celtic. Like maybe in a striker role, but we kind of already have guys doing that. So is he a box to box 8 and a 4-3-3? I'm not sure. I have some squishiness on that. So he's very good technically. Like he actually does have some of those earmarks for IQ outside of his shooting decisions. He seems to get hyper when he gets around the box. So that's it's all contextual as far as phase of the play. Trusty, I don't know. He's one of those where I'm not sure. I'm not sure I get that one yet. On the ball, his performance levels, and I looked at him both in MLS when he was younger and then in the English Championship before, that debacle of a season, which again, I just don't think it's fair to look at any defender on a team that was as bad as Sheffield were in the Premier League last season. So again, a good player, looks like a pretty good defender. I'm not sure on his game intelligence. That'd be the flag that I see there. Something like his foul rate is high relative, like he runs around a lot and he gets in a lot of duels, doesn't win a ton of them, and he fouls a lot. So that's, again, to me, that's a flag for game intelligence. And you combine that with some of his like short passing data that's doesn't rank real high. So I think about that as like a fragile combination relative to a high line center back at Celtic. So that kind of thing where it's a flag for him. Volley looks like a solid player. I'm not sure. Again, a lot of some deficits on creativity and on the ball type of stuff, which again doesn't fit with what you would think coming out of Barcelona. But another guy where he's been on fairly ball dominant teams that they don't play long ball, and his ability to execute short passes and kind of standard, what you would consider standard build up passes. Okay. Yep. Yeah. I'll start with Valley. So Valley's interesting because, he comes out of the Barcelona system, and one would think that he would be, kind of that classic high functioning on ball, ticky tacky type of player. And it's actually the opposite of that, which is, like I said, kind of weird. So he looks like a good player, solid defensively. Doesn't seem to have like elite speed or high end speed. And he's like almost the opposite of Greg Taylor. So I'm not sure how he would be good at inverting and doing like close, short passes. And that kind of thing. So again, contextual depends on how they would be used. Bosic, the one I think clearly has what I call the most robust profile. And the last two players that I said had in my process had robust profiles. And what does that mean? Like they look good across the board in varying degrees, not any huge gaps where you say, oh, icky, like, well, that's an issue. Where Matt O'Reilly and Kyoko. So, you pay what you get for kind of thing. I have a more reservation with Bosic than I did with those two, by a decent degree. Like he's not as extreme in that robustness as those two players were. And again, I don't see like a natural obvious fit as far as what his positional use would be at Celtic. But because of that robustness, like I think he could be good in multiple roles. And that in and of itself, as I've said before, has a lot of value.
Yeah, I think it certainly does. Alan, before we close things out, just to get your thoughts on a little bit of what James said there, and to touch on the question that I did want to ask about it, and James, obviously, feel free to jump in if you feel there's anything you need to add to it. The benchmarking is really interesting to watch, but as James mentioned, it's very much within the context of where the player has been playing, the level that they've been playing at, the opposition they've been facing in the leagues that they're in. So my example for that is Bogic playing in MLS. If we assume, I know this will annoy some people, but if we assume the MLS at large is a higher level than the Scottish Premiership, can we take from that, and I know there's obvious caveats, but can we take from that a player who plays well in a better league will automatically transfer to be an even higher standard of player in a lesser league? How, in your experience, how does that kind of transfer work?
I think the short answer is no, you can't. Right? The contexts are just so sensitive, really, and can be very specific. So when James was talking about Trusty there, and also Valle from Barcelona, so the two players that sprang into my head, seared there, and is would you take a highly experienced international left back from AC Milan, who is an incredibly aggressive defender, plays regularly for an international team with a reputation for absolute, just insane levels of defensive. They would die rather than let a fullback go past them. That kind of thing. You start to get excited, aren't you? Right. So, but somebody like, I'm talking about Diego Laxalt, is completely unsuited to playing for a club like Celtic in the way that Celtic play. If I said to you, we're going to sign a centre back, never loses a header, never loses a header. It just won't happen, right? Vastly experienced international player, played for years in the English Premier League, played for, not for a top team in the middle of the table. Real goal threat at the other end as well. You're getting excited, aren't you? But I'm talking about Shane Duffy, right? Completely unsuited to playing for Celtic, completely unsuited to a high line, and completely unsuited to being a ball-playing centre-back, right? Both of those players are very good professional footballers, no doubt about it, right? Utterly unsuitable to play for Celtic. Now, when you put them together in the same team, then you've got absolute bloody carnage, right? And that's on Neil Lennon, that. But I'm not trying to pick at old scabs. I'm just pointing out, trying to answer your question using those examples, which is you can have on the face of it, in context, very effective professional football players, but playing for Celtic is highly specific. As James says, Desta's numbers look good now. If we took a snapshot of the Scottish Premier League season today, you could make it, if you're an idiot as far as data was concerned, you could make a case for asking for 20 million for Matondo, Lawrence, and Dessers based on the stat padding that they achieved simply against Ross County, because the numbers look insane now, right? That's just a terrible use of data. Now, I'm sure nobody would be as stupid to do that, but you get the point I'm crudely making, right? So, people that use percentiles to highlight to people in other leagues how Celtic and the Rangers players profile is just stupidity, because the teams are so dominant over the rest of the league that the numbers look amazing. So these are the obvious pitfalls that you have to look at. James avoided Trusty in his Sheffield United season. So I didn't see a lot of Sheffield United last season. I didn't see Trusty play. Got a lot of friends that are Sheffield United fans that they're not impressed with him. But he was playing in a team that was arguably the worst team that's ever played in the English Premier League, in a defence that had lost through injury all the best defenders, and he was trying to shore things up. In front of a midfield that had Oliver Norwood in the holding role, bless him, right? So you just wouldn't use that as an example, really, and you wouldn't look at that either way, really, and say this guy's going to be a disaster for Celtic. Neither could you look at it and say, oh, he's going to be fine, because that context doesn't matter. What James is talking about is, what are the indicators of IQ? So positioning. What gives you an indicator of positioning? What gives you an indication about decision making? And clearly last season for Trusty, that would have been put under stress. So you'd have seen that in a stress scenario, right? Now, he probably is going to look really good in a well-drilled team, a well-coached side, at home to Ross County. He's going to look probably very, very functional, absolutely. But how when you stress it, what's he going to look like? And those are the insights that you have to try and gain from these benchmarking exercises. It's not easy to do, and that's why you need talented people with good data in the building at Celtic Park to do that. It is all about context, but it's all about extrapolating that context and applying it to your situation, in this case, a very dominant Celtic side in a league the standard of the SPFL, and trying to gauge what is insight versus just a number that lacks the context to actually use to make decisions. So I doubt we've given people the answers they want, because all they wanted to really hear was, Bogut's good, bad, Fally, good, bad. We can't say that. All we can say is, does this look a smart move based on the data that we have and the context in which it is gathered?
So for all the stats we could mine and all the data we could forage, none of us have a crystal ball, and we're not to know for sure, but we can only cross our fingers and hope. That's it for this week's show. Some of you might be wondering why we haven't touched on a particular fixture that's coming up this weekend. James, I'm going to hand over to you before we sign off to explain to everybody where they can hear yours and Alan's thoughts on the upcoming fixture this weekend.
Yeah, so part of the renaissance of the huddle breakdown is we try to figure out what we're doing. We've asked Martin Murphy to join us on Thursday. We're going to do a preview show looking at the Derby matchup, probably I'm sure there might be theoretically some transfer window news by then. We'll see. Touch upon any breaking news there as well. But yeah, for the most part, we'll be discussing and looking forward on Thursday, and hopefully get that out sometime late Thursday into Friday morning.
That's exciting. I'll certainly be listening in, as I'm sure will be the listeners who've kindly informed me they don't like my monotone voice or my in-jokes or my various other things that have apparently completely ruined this podcast. But thank you very much to James.
No, hang on, there's a few more, Laura. You've not listed them all. I've had a few more here. Hang on. Let me get my paper.
Listen, if you really want to dislike me, follow me on Twitter. That's where it gets really good. No, but thank you, James. Thank you, Alan, for having me again this week. It's been a fun one, and hopefully we'll have a positive result to discuss next week. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Huddle Breakdown, and we will catch you again in a week's time.